For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh. Revi. Our expert analyst today is Akriti Vasudeva. Akriti, thanks so much for giving us your time. It's good to do an interview in person when you guys come into India now and then. I mean, we haven't started traveling to you in the US so far, but thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Amitabh. It's really great to see you in person.
Pleasure. Just looking at one of your recent commentaries, taking off from there, because you started off with the Chief of Army Staff's comments. He was talking about the Russia-Ukraine war and its effects on India and the pandemic. But off late, he's made very frank and some would say brutally honest comments about China. What's your reading of that? Because it's obviously a kind of a government position that India is taking, not pussyfooting around when it comes to naming China.
I thought his recent comments in Pune were really interesting, very plain-spoken, very forthright, in some ways unexpected. I mean, he talks about Chinese belligerence, totalitarianism. He talks about Beijing, agrees with the idea of might is right. He actually draws a comparison between India's inclusive posture in the Indo-Pacific to China's more exclusivist posture. He, mentions things like stealing IPR on the Chinese part, weaponization of supply chains, really kind of the gamut of issues in the India-China relationship. To me, I think that my thing is just that maybe the military is getting more and more clear-eyed on the Chinese threat. I also think that, some of that has happened politically when you look at, for example, Dr. Jaishankar's statements on the India-China relationship, how the border can no longer be, bracketed or divorced from the rest of the relationship. But this is definitely a much more emphatic statement of how you need to look at, India-China ties going forward. And, the speech that you mentioned, I actually found that speech, the one that he gave in the annual conference of the Army, and then I think he also spoke to StratNews Global later on the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war on India. Similarly, very candid. He actually talks about the sustenance issues that the armies had as a direct fallout of the Russia-Ukraine war, and talks about self-reliance and indigenization, the importance of that, and kind of thinking about those factors in a national security sense, which are the partners that India is going to think about or what it needs to do to develop its capabilities. So I think it's maybe just an appreciation of the current geostrategic environment that India finds itself in, and thinking about what those long-term choices are going to be in terms of strategy.
In terms of long-term strategies and a lot of partnerships that are developing around the globe, just looking at India and the U.S. and a national security advisor-driven kind of initiative, the iCET, which happened. Your assessment of that and where it's going?
So I think the initiative for critical and emerging technology between the U.S. and India, the inaugural meeting was in February of this year. I see this as, more of sort of a grander defense trade and technology initiative. You still have the U.S.-India DTTI initiative going forward, but that's more focused, I think, right now, sort of proof of concept of what the U.S. and India can do together in terms of co-development and co-production. I see the iCET as much more ambitious. As you said, it is driven by the two NSAs. So it has sort of the political backing at the highest levels to once and for all really figure out the issues between the U.S. and India on technology, on defense, co-development and co-production. And I think it also is driven a little bit by the Russia-Ukraine war, because as India is looking to reduce its dependence on Russia, the U.S. wants to, provide India options and see what's really out there, what is the potential in the relationship. And that's where you have, a discussion on future technologies, you have a discussion on jet engines, you have a really kind of a wide variety of capabilities that two countries are looking at together. And I do think, obviously this initiative is also going to face similar challenges to what we've seen with TTTI. So, on the US side, of course, things such as the export control restrictions, the issues with transfer of technology, the issues with enticing, American private defense firms to actually partner this technology will have to be figured out. On the Indian side, making actually a business case for being able to buy some of these technologies that are developed, figuring out, the defense procedures and the regulatory policies that will actually make sure that, these sales or purchases of this production happens will also have to be figured out. But I do see this as both sides really trying to look at an ambitious agenda and hoping to work together in the future.
Some of the issues you have already raised with DTI, it's been almost more than a decade now.
Mm-hmm.
The progress, both sides have issues. I mean, apart from the bureaucratic red tape, more on one side. What is it that you see that is holding India and U.S. back on that front?
I think my sense of that initiative is that when it started, there was really a top-down focus on it. Secretary Carter directly would look at sort of the day-to-day workings of that and ask for updates. And there was a lot of enthusiasm both on the US and India side to actually align their procedures such that the two countries could work together. And I do think that in some ways that initiative or the other things that it sort of sprung up did help the relationship. I mean, the fact that India got the major defense partner status from the US, the SDA-1 authorization. All of that has actually helped the relationship. It has helped the US and India actually talk about, technology and co-development. But perhaps what happened there was just a misalignment in terms of the expectations that both sides had from the initiative. My understanding is that the US side was much more focused on the trade side of the defense trade and technology initiative. And on the Indian side, the focus was much more on technology. And so, both sides had put forward a lot of initiatives, put forward a lot of projects that they could work on together, but they just could not figure it out because from the beginning, their expectations or alignments of what that initiative was supposed to be didn't match. And so I think, hopefully the new project that both sides have now signed on developing the UAVs is actually going to go forward and hopefully will be helping the US and India actually develop habits of cooperation and developing things together. So let's see how that goes.
That realignment because India is extremely clear. When you're talking about co-production or co-research and development, whatever it is, co-manufacturing, in alignment with Atmanirbhar. Now, has the world and has the US been able to understand that is what it's going to be like?
Mm-hmm. I think that there is an understanding of the Indian position on why, the Make in India program or the self-reliance or the Atmanirbhar program has come about. And at least the way I see it, it is driven by, multiple factors. It is driven by the pandemic. It is driven by the state of the India-China relationship, and those two combined in some ways, India realizing that it actually has to think about where it has to think about supply chains, has to think about not relying on anyone else for its sort of national security consideration. So I think there is a sense of that. There is an understanding of that in the US. Of course, there have been concerns about whether this would actually close out opportunities for India to develop partnerships with other countries in the West, like the US or France and Israel. But I think the way that we're talking about that now, I think there is actually space to do both. There is space for India to keep the kind of self-reliance and indigenous development aspect, but also work together with other countries on future technologies, especially looking at the threat from China. That is a common threat that all the sides have. And I do think that both sides have actually done a good job of trying to understand each other's concerns and work together on how Make in India can actually be embraced by American companies, for example, like Lockheed Martin or Boeing as well.
And the need that the West sees and the US in particular, how should I put it, diversifying away from legacy Russian equipment would obviously mean that you provide something.
Right.
That understanding would be there, but you see there's a mesh in how the US wants India to move away from Russia, and India is doing that as well. And the conditionalities or the priorities that India have, do they kind of mesh?
I think, that is going to be obviously a little bit of a difficult transition, a difficult conversation in the next few years. I mean, it also has historically been for the US-Indian relationship, right? I don't think that the US was ever really comfortable with the last dependence that India had on the Soviet Union or Russia. But, India itself realized after the fall of the Soviet Union that, again, it couldn't really be dependent on one country for its spare parts, and that kind of diversification away to different partners started in the 90s and has gone on through 2000s up until now. So I think my sense is that both sides are going to continue to talk about it. The US obviously realizes that India does need to reduce its dependence on Russia because of sort of national security considerations, which we can get into later. But I think the point that I've heard made is reached circles in the US, and a point that I've made as well is that if the outcome that the US actually cares about in the end is for India to develop its own capabilities to be able to actually compete with China effectively, there is no need for that capability to only come from the US. If the two sides are not able to figure out that procedure for whatever reason, there are other partners that India is working with, like France, like Israel, that can perhaps deliver that more effectively. And I think that there is some appreciation of that moving forward.
In terms of the other partnerships that you were talking about, of course, there is AUKUS, which is talking about nuclear propulsion technology. Again, interesting developments there. I think it was Ashley Tellis who kind of proposed that whether India and France do something like that. But on Quad, how do you see the movement there? Of course, again, officially, it's not necessarily anti-China. That's what the official position is. But it has moved forward only because of this major threat and aggression from China. How do you see the Quad developing as of now and in the near future?
Yeah, I mean, I think perhaps it's difficult for you have to kind of keep in mind messaging on the Quad from the government's perspective to ensure that it's inclusive and that the Quad countries are actually taking the concerns of, say, ASEAN or others in the region on board. But it is true that the Quad only came about because the aligning threat perceptions of these countries, on China have propagated it. And I think really the struggle perhaps the Quad is having right now is to how to message to different audiences. On the one hand, what the Quad is trying to do, and I think importantly so, is actually try to provide alternatives to China in the region, whether that's through infrastructure, connectivity, capacity building, maritime domain awareness, etc. But while doing that, while kind of providing those public goods, it also the idea of the Quad is also to be a deterrent to Chinese aggression or Chinese coercion. And so it does also need to message that there are aspects or components of the Quad that can be, sort of dialed up or can be building blocks for if there is a future contingency in which these countries would have to, deal with that. And so I think we will see more of a focus on the sort of, proof of concept side of the Quad, more providing initiatives, more providing kind of products, tangible outcomes that countries in the region actually need, but quietly probably also a discussion of how you can move the sort of, ledger and the agenda on trying to put those building blocks in place for dealing with an, eventual contingency.
And when you talk about these discussions of these four countries together in the Quad, but there's so many other minilaterals, plurilaterals, trilaterals, if you want to call them. Now there's talk of possibly at the highest level, Macron, Modi, and Albanese meet on the sidelines of the G20. There's already in Indonesia, Australia, India, Japan. All of these. though none of them say that they are projected against China, they've all suddenly picked up in momentum because of that reason again.
Yeah, I mean, I think what all of the, countries in the region in the Indo-Pacific are trying to do is actually deal with the rise of China, is to manage what is happening in the region because of some of the actions that is taken, whether it's through the Belt and Road Initiative, whether it's through, militarization of islands in the South China Sea, but also perhaps in some cases also dealing with their own blindness to some of the countries in the region that, they probably didn't pay attention to very much. The grievances of some of the countries, smaller countries, particularly in the region, that were asking for support and, help and alternatives, and maybe the great powers or, regional leaders didn't actually pay attention to. So that's why you see sort of the springing up of, the different groupings, whether that's, trilaterals or multilateral groupings, to try to, deal with the different challenges that come with that. But also, I think broadly, to actually, these countries, particularly India, for example, it aspires to a global leadership. And the idea there is to, find as many sort of groupings and initiatives that you can where you're able to provide, you're able to kind of further that idea in the region or globally. And I think we'll see how it goes. But I also think that the priorities of some of these partners regionally might be different, right? For example, like India and Australia see the region, Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean region, much more aligned than perhaps, the U.S. and India would in some ways. And so you're trying to maximize the options. You're trying to see in which partnership or grouping you can actually get the most bang for your buck, and also thematically, the countries are interested in different issues. India and Australia are interested in critical minerals, others are interested in cybersecurity, others are interested in, climate change, although it's a more common idea. So that's what I'm saying.
And talking about groupings, how do you see India dealing with Russia and China, or the U.S. dealing with the Russia-China no limit partnership?
Yeah, I think this is, to my mind at least, it's the beginnings of a debate on what the Russia-China relationship means for India. Obviously, India's watched this relationship for a long time, particularly, after sort of the 2014 period when Russia and China really got closer together. And to my mind, the reason why India has really invested so much diplomatic capital in the RIC, for example, or the BRICS or SCO, is to ensure that Russia and China don't get too close together in a way that would actually impact India's interests. But I feel like that strategy might sort of needs to be discussed going forward, because as we see the Russia-Ukraine war go forward, and you see Russia, its economy being more and more tightened, because the sanctions, its ability to really project power being constrained, a weakened Russia that's more dependent on China is definitely going to be a challenge that India has to contend with. And, whether that's sort of diplomatically or politically, or specifically in the defense sense, where India has to actually think about what it means if, a Russia that is more dependent on China, what if, China actually tries to impact basically Russian neutrality in an India-China standoff, or if the impact of sanctions or Russia's ability to deliver big-ticket items continues, and Russia becomes more dependent on China, even for components and parts. What does that mean for India's national security, and operational environment and its capabilities as well? So I think, again, this is going to be a difficult debate, because there are merits on both sides. There are definitely merits on wanting to keep, Russia and China close and trying to ensure that India's voice is heard when, conversations happen in that trilateral, but also, we've seen Russia be so openly critical of the Quad, openly, obviously the Russia-China relationship is deepening. And so, decisions will probably need to be made down the road of how Delhi sees this relationship in in its in its environment and its national security interest.
Where you're coming, there's a lot of talk about China. I mean, Biden administration feels they're talking about defense budget there, of course, and now China's a big prong in that. Do you see that as now, well, nothing set in stone, but the fact that when so much capital, whether it's financial, strategic, has been invested in Ukraine, doesn't the U.S. and the West have the capital, mainly the U.S., to look at the Indo-Pacific and China and deal with two fronts at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely a conversation I hear a lot. It is a legitimate discussion to have. But I think that the U.S. views on China actually evolved over a long period of time. It's not a decision that the U.S. strategic community came to slowly. It took about 20, 25 years from the discussion, the U.S.-China relationship in the 2000s. To the concerns about the stating of the IBR, to basically the relationship was doing really well both economically and diplomatically and politically, but over the years, over the last 20 years, because of Chinese actions, whether in the South China Sea or East China Sea, its coercion of neighbors, it's the disenchantment of U.S. private firms in China as well. All of that together, all of these different stakeholders have come kind of to the same conclusion of everything that the U.S. did to make China a responsible stakeholder has actually not worked. So I don't think that we should take that, evolution of the U.S. position in China across both parties, also the Republican as well as Democrat, lightly. But yes, I think in the near to medium term, there definitely would be trade-offs. You have to think about how the Russia-Ukraine war, the U.S. investment in Ukraine, or greater investment now in Europe is going to at least distract or take away from attention on the Indo-Pacific, and that's where the other Quad members are actually going to be a helpful balancer, where they can kind of bring the U.S. back in, even though the U.S. has actually invested a lot of diplomatic capital in the Quad. It's the Biden administration is the one that actually, pushed for it to become a leader-level summit. So I do think that, that attention is going to continue. But I think, other groupings and, Quad members can actually bring the U.S. on side if there is a concern about, a distraction on that side.
Akriti, absolutely appreciate your time, and thanks for coming into our studio, which is still evolving at the moment, a new studio. Absolutely great pleasure having you on.
Thank you so much for having that with them.
And to all our viewers, if you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up on YouTube. You can follow all our social media handles, the Telegram channel also, that will keep you posted as to when we put up articles on our website or interviews like this with Akriti on our YouTube channel. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh.